Okay, so this, thank you everyone, first of all, for being here. And I'm just going to tell you guys the story of my family over the last three generations in San Diego, and kind of how freeways and city planning issues have shaped our lives throughout the generations. So I'm going to start here with this quote from 1971. Of all the services, facilities, and other amenities a community provides, few matter more to the individual and his family than the kind of housing he lives in and the kind of neighborhood of which that housing is a part. Through the ages, men have fought to defend their homes. They have struggled and often dared the wilderness in order to secure better homes. It is not surprising, therefore, that public policies affecting the kind and location of homes available should be the subject of intense and widespread interest, and also of intense, far-ranging, and sometimes passionate debate. And that is part of President Nixon's statement in 1971. This, for context, the 1968 Fair Housing Act had been passed just a couple years prior, just days after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And we're going to dive into this a little bit later in the presentation, as we're all still passionately debating this 50 years later. But before that, I'm going to take you back a little bit further in time. So this, I'm a third generation San Diegan, and so I'm going to share the story of how my family history intersected with redlining, freeway construction, and suburbanization since the 30s. These forces have helped shape the built environment our cities for over the last 100 years and influence how we relate to each other in them. I'll only be able to scratch the surface, but hopefully each of you will be able to draw parallels to your own experiences. So my grandfather arrived in San Diego in the late 1930s via the Navy. So to give you a context of my family's movement over the three generations, my grandfather started on Liberty Street. That's where that's not where he started, but that's where our story starts. And that's where the family lived at the time that my father was born in 1946. So at the time, the area was very sparsely developed. It was basically marshland, and it didn't have a colored grade. It was Mission Bay was very swampy at the time. So they moved to G Street in 1956. And so as you can see, most of Southeast San Diego is redlined, and we'll talk about that. And then my parents moved to Claremont as a young family in 1971, which was the same year as that quote from the beginning. And that's where I was raised, and it wasn't on this map yet. So as I'm sure many of you know, in the post-Depression recovery as part of the New Deal in 1933, FDR created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and their purpose was to stabilize the housing market by restructuring mortgages. In order to categorize risk, they created these color-coded maps of every major metropolitan area across the country. Green was the most desirable, and red was the highest risk. And neighborhoods earned a red color if minorities lived in them or even near them, even if it was the middle-class neighborhood of single-family homes. So this map of San Diego was published in 1936. So you can see here some of the descriptions of how they were regarded. So this area, this is talking about the area that my dad grew up in the 50s and 60s. This area is one of the oldest parts of the cities, being inhabited by various types of residents, running from Mexicans in some parts of the area to more or less all white in other parts. There is an influx of small industrial plants and businesses, apartment houses and other multiple dwellings, also many cheap rooming houses. The area is definitely hazardous. In the middle southern portion, a great many Mexicans with a definite trend of infiltration of this element. North portion occupied by mixed races, colored, Mexican, lower salaried, white race, laborers, etc. Range of income was $750 to $1,500. Racial concentration of a colored fraternity. Homes show only slight degree of pride of ownership and on average are negligently maintained. So as a contrast, this is La Jolla. And so La Jolla was kind of isolated from the rest of the city proper, and it's still one of the wealthiest parts of the city. So some of the descriptions are residents are all white collar classes, professional men, retired people and businessmen, artists and writers with an income range of 2,000 to 20,000. Lots carry deed restrictions as to races, buildings, architectural design, etc. This is probably one of the most attractive and highest rated districts for large homes and estates in the La Jolla area. Residents are 100% white. No influx whatever of any inharmonious influences. They also talk about the 18-hole championship golf course with attractive clubhouse. No influx whatever of any inharmonious influences. All utilities are in. So we're going to skip forward a little bit here to 1948. Here circled is the Liberty Street area that I mentioned before. So they live right on Liberty Street. That was on the outskirts of what became the frontier homes in World War II. So I actually recently found a cover story in the San Diego Reader from 1992 that characterized the history of this area. So if you had a chance to read it, I think Elizabeth sent it out in a link to one of the invitations for this webinar. The article was actually a source document for the Historic Context Report for the program EIR for the City of San Diego's 2018 Midway Pacific Highway Community Plan, which I read because, of course, I read an appendix to a community plan EIR. Not the first time, and it won't be the last. But I have to say the reader article was much more colorful and entertaining. And I invite you to read it to get a flavor of the area during the time that my grandparents and their young family lived there. Frontier Homes was actually one of the largest World War II worker housing projects to date. They had built Linda Vista, which you can see here. Those were actually permanent homes that still mostly stand in our neighborhood today, but the homes in the Midway area were not intended to be permanent. They were intended to be temporary. They were pretty low quality construction, and they were intended to be pulled down after the war. So even before frontier homes were built, it was not a well-regarded part of town. There are a number of reasons, and the article goes into a lot of detail on that. And there was a nearby restricted area called Loma Portal. And so I think we all know what restricted means. We already went over that. And they actually mounted a NIMBY campaign. So this has been going on for a long time against the project. They did not want the war workers in temporary housing near their area. And just to go here to these pictures, this is my dad as the baby with his older sister. He was the middle of 5. And so I know for sure this was a Liberty Street house because that's the address. And my grandmother was known for these big hydrangeas. So I actually have hydrangeas in front of our house in honor of that. So nevertheless, frontier housing was built. So this is an aerial from 1946. They started construction, I think, in 43, 44. So you can see that the Liberty Street area is on the outskirts of even Frontier. It's like the edge. I mean, just beyond on the top of that picture is the ocean. And it looks from here to be pretty rough, pretty crude. It doesn't look like there's paved streets or much more else going on. So I don't know the exact timing of when my grandparents moved there, but that is where my dad lived as a young child, and they were adjacent to the frontier housing, not in it. So most of this area, after it served its purpose as temporary war housing, there was still a large housing shortage in San Diego. And so people stayed on in the housing. They actually didn't completely demolish it until the 60s. There was basically during this time was when the suburbs were being constructed, including Claremont, which was the first post-World War II suburb in San Diego. And so anyone who could move out of here did. Anyone who couldn't get housing anywhere else ended up here. And so that reader article really goes into a lot of detail of just kind of the seedy nature of how it was regarded. And honestly, like, if anyone knows San Diego, I grew up there, 80s and 90s, left in the mid 90s, and that's where the topless bars are. And if you wanted to get a hotel room without having to show ID, that's probably where you would get one, that kind of a thing. So um, it was pretty much demolished after the housing was vacated. The city actually owned the property, and so they really wanted to redevelop it. So there were many grand plans for the area, one of which was actually for a World's Fair. And Glenn Rick, who was the founder of Rick Engineering, he was the city's planning director for many years. And the article touches on the story that the redevelopment of the frontier area was one of his first jobs as a consultant. And that proposal was to be a mall. But when the shopping mall did come to San Diego, it was with the competing proposal in Mission Valley. So that's Mission Valley Mall. There were a lot of variations on what to do with the area, lots of plans in the late 50s, early 60s, but what ended up becoming the anchor is the sports arena, which you could see here on the edge of the screen. So that's the landmark anchor that we all know there today. And so the area of Liberty Street that my dad grew up on is now the on-ramp to the 8 freeway. So it would have been right under there. During this time in the 50s, or really the 60s, this was when there were a lot of major changes to the San Diego River being channelized that you can see, and Mission Bay being built out, and which was very highly engineered. You saw some of these earlier photos. You can see how swampy and marshy it was and kind of meandering. So there was a lot of public works projects that went on in San Diego during that time. And this was also when the 8 freeway was constructed. So during this time, my grandfather actually owned a house moving business after the war. So it was called Ace House Movers. His office was on Pacific Highway, and that building is actually still there. Originally was a home that's a commercial use now. And so when frontier housing was relinquished by the federal government in 54, 55, the city had control of the buildings and set to tear them down. And so the stories that I heard growing up about this era from my dad, as you can see, he was a kid tagging along with his dad, was that many of the houses that my grandfather had moved were taken to Mexico. And so this 92 article actually goes into some detail about that and validates those stories. There's a quote from the article: during the mid-50s, smaller operators had done thriving trade selling surplus housing around the county. That would have been my grandfather. And then he says, former PHA district housing manager Kimball Moore recently described the salvaging of a few of these houses. The upper stories of about 20 or so buildings were taken off and moved by truck down to Tijuana to a settlement house type operation called Project Amigos. The full name in Spanish was Central Social Juarez y Lincoln. And then there's a quote from the San Diego Daily Transcript from 1954, kind of tells you the I guess the way the city regarded these housing units. The city's 3,000 temporary housing units can go begging as far as mayors of county cities are concerned. The other day at a special meeting at Civic Center of county mayors, they agreed with City Manager Campbell the units don't belong in the San Diego area. Council has already asked that the 3,000 be moved to Imperial County or Mexico, provided officials there want the dwellings. Councilmen feel they might be used for migrant farm workers in Imperial Valley and low-income families in Mexico. So another thing that happened with these frontier housing units was that they were built with 2x3 studs. And again, they were intended to be temporary, but when a particular businessman had bought a number of the units intending to move them somewhere else, the city decided that they didn't meet building code. They decided the building code was that they had to be 2x4s. And so it made that infeasible for them to move them anywhere within the city limits. So during the time that this area was being dismantled for redevelopment, there were other factors going on with constructions of freeways that would connect downtown to the growing post-World War II suburbs like Claremont, which is where I ended up as a kid. And those were being built with FHA-backed loans for middle-class home buyers. So upon their exit from Liberty Street in about 1956, my grandfather somehow got a piece of land in the Logan Heights area of Southeast San Diego on 25th and G Streets. And that was just as the 94 freeway was being built. So for orientation, you guys can see my cursor move around, right? On the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So this here is the footprint of what became the 94 freeway. You can see a little bit further here, this was the continuation. And then here is where the 15 freeway ended up being. And so the area that my dad grew up was right here on 25th. This is Market Street. My mom actually grew up right here. They arrived at about the same time, but didn't meet each other till high school. So this is G Street and F Street. So this map is from 1956. So it's right before these houses ended up getting removed. And you can see there's already some grading kind of going on in this undeveloped area prior to the freeway being constructed. So the area that my dad's family landed was right here next to the freeway, and it was well known and that Market Street was the dividing line between the Black and Hispanic neighborhood to the south and the whiter neighborhood to the north, which went up to Golden Hill and Balboa Park, which was on the right side of this picture. No, left side, I'm sorry, north is left on this picture. So the construction of the freeway demolished this entire city block. And even to this day, the sidewalk and driveway curb cuts of the demolished homes are still there. And so I went back and visited with my mom a couple years ago and pointed that out because as a city planner, I would notice that. And she had never noticed that. It was just one of those things that kind of blends into the background and didn't really think about it. So I already read some of the redlining documents about this area of San Diego and how this was redlined and how it was regarded at the time. So since my grandfather's business was in house moving, during this time, he relocated 5 residential units that were multifamily residential units onto the property that they ended up on 25th and G Streets. And presumably they were in the path of demolition to build the freeway. So this photo here is of the building my dad grew up in from, about 56 to when he left for Vietnam in 66, 67. And so this is in its original location. You can see it's on a slope. It has a garage, ground floor. And I haven't been able to pinpoint where this building came from, but there are other photos in the series that show it coming off of the property from F streets, between F and G, but I don't know what numbered street, but it's a pretty fascinating set of images. They were actually photographed by Norman Baynard, who you can see here, it's embossed Baynard Studio. He was a pretty famous photographer that documented that area from the 40s to the 80s. And so my grandfather had actually commissioned a professional photographer to take photos. So that probably was a big deal back at the time. So here's another image of the building now off the foundation, and it's getting backed down G Street into where it ends up getting getting placed. And I'm going to mention that many of these pictures are actually in the San Diego History Center photo archives. Baynard's children donated his negatives of his archives to the History Center after his death. And so I've actually visited there and looked at pictures, and my dad has a folder of original embossed prints that the History Center didn't even have. So they took some of ours to add to their collection as well. Here's a picture of the house or the building being lowered into the canyon, and they built up the foundation underneath it. So it was on a slope. I don't know how I would feel about being those guys underneath that huge building. And I've also been told that the cross beams that you see underneath were actually wood from the piers down at the docks that were being dismantled. So they repurposed that wood to lace it underneath these large buildings. The perspective that we're looking at here is looking north. And so this here beyond the building is the footprint of what becomes the freeway. So you can see it's kind of in various states of disassembly. And so that ends up being the freeway where that car is parked. And then this is a picture of that building as it stands today looking south. So the freeway is behind me. And so, yeah, that's been standing there for what, 60 years? And who knows when, I don't know when it was originally built. I would love to have like a real life episode of This Is Us, that me as my adult self now could go back and talk to my grandfather's adult self and even my dad, and ask them all the questions and understand the nuances of all these forces that were going on. I do have some internal tension as I'm like learning about this history that I knew very little bit about growing up. My grandfather had a role in changing the landscape of the city and had an effect of displacing people during a time of major freeway construction. He was part of that machine. But I'm also intrigued by the fact that at least some of these homes were salvaged and they continued their lives in another place, and they didn't end up dismantled in a landfill. And they're still to this day serving their function to house people. So all of the buildings that got moved to this location are still there. So this is an aerial of that same view from before of how it looks today. So you can see this is the 5 freeway running. It runs north-south across the bottom of the freeway. They took out much of 18th Street to build that. It took out Little Italy. It separated Logan Heights from the waterfront. And you probably know the story of the 5 at the Coronado Bridge being demolished. The community was demolished to build the bridge, and underneath the footings of the bridge, the community had been told there would be a park, but by the time it was graded in 1970, it was intended to be a California Highway Patrol station. And the community revolted and famously staged an occupation of the site until the city and state acquiesced and dedicated it as Chicano Park, which is on the National Register of Historic Places. Another freeway interrupted story in this area was the South Crest area. The 15 freeway was supposed to be have a connection to a new Route 232, and that would have cut right through the heart of the community. And the land for the freeway was actually mostly cleared of homes, and the transition ramp from the 15 was constructed, and that's kind of over in this area of the picture. That freeway ramp ended up going to nowhere because they ended up not building the freeway, and there's now a linear park where the freeway would have gone. So next here you see the juxtaposition of the redlining map with the recent Callan Bioscreen pollution map. So you can see that these areas that are transversed by these freeways in these older areas of the city have the highest levels of pollution. There's San Diego's not at all unique in this respect. There's examples of freeways all over the country where middle and lower class minority neighborhoods were demolished for freeway constructions. And that left the remaining residents with negative health impacts of living next to a freeway in older homes that don't have the benefit of the modern air filtration systems that are required when we're building residential developments next to freeways today. In these historically poor and minority areas of the city, these conditions were perpetuated for decades by discriminatory housing and land use practices. And those areas continue to bear disproportionate health impacts of these decisions that were made years ago. So I'm going to shift a little bit to now my parents. I've told you about my dad. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my mom. She was born in Hawaii, also in 1946. It was still a U.S. territory. World War II had just ended. And my grandmother was 18 when she met my grandfather, and then he was a Navy sailor who was stationed at Pearl Harbor. And my mom was the oldest of 5. They moved to San Diego in 1951 when she was 5 years old. They moved in a couple different Navy housing locations, but ended up on this rental house on Market Street and 24th, again, right down the street from where my dad was at the same time. This is the house that she grew up in as it is today. I think it is a 2-unit duplex rental. So I like to refer to my parents as the quintessential baby boomers. They were both born in 1946, both to military families. They graduated in 1964. My dad enlisted in the Air Force in 66, and they married just a few weeks before he went off to basic training. And he was deployed to Vietnam in 67, served for 2 years there, came home on Christmas Day of 69. And he they'll learn this history someday. So he started his new job at Pacific Bell a few weeks after getting back from Vietnam, and he worked there his entire career until he retired early 2000s. My sister, the oldest, was born within a year of getting back in 1970, and they purchased their modest single-family home in 1971 with the assistance of the GI Bill in Claremont, which is where I was born and raised, and my mom still lives there. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Claremont. It was developed starting in 1950 and was San Diego's first post-World War II master planned suburb. It was situated north of San Diego proper, so it was designed with its own commercial centers, and the streets curved with the topography. There's a series of canyons and mesas that you can see were probably pretty well graded to get that flat topography for the development. This was a deviation from the grid pattern that characterized most of the rest of San Diego, and it was pretty revolutionary at the time. It was significant because it established in San Diego, the pattern of suburbanization that dominated post-World War II development in the US overall. Claremont was one of many suburbs in the US that was built during this time that employed the practices of race-restricted covenants that were commonly used in the 1900s. We've read about them a little bit already. They were in practice through the mid-1950s to limit the sale, rental, and resale of suburban single-family homes to only white people. The Federal Housing Authority also required, as a condition of financing to developers for large subdivisions, that they include racial restrictive covenants as a condition of the loan. The Supreme Court ruled in 1948 that these race-based restrictive covenants were unenforceable in the Shelley versus Kramer case. However, the FHA continued the practice, and it wasn't until 1962 when President JFK signed an executive order prohibiting the use of federal funds to support racial discrimination in housing that the FHA finally stopped this practice. So Claremont was being built as parts of the inner city, like frontier housing, were being dismantled to facilitate the construction of freeways to serve these suburbs that were only available to white people. The 92 Reader article also has some interesting insights into this next wave of housing construction in San Diego. So I'm gonna a little bit go over some of the larger forces that were going on nationally. The 60s set the stage for the civil rights movement. which culminated in the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act. And it sought to eliminate discrimination in all aspects of housing and to affirmatively further fair housing. And I'm sure many of you have heard affirmatively furthering fair housing a lot lately, as there's been a California bill passed to implement that starting this year. So at the beginning of Nixon's term in '69, then Director of Housing and Urban Development George Romney, who was Mitt Romney's father, enthusiastically embraced this directive, and he worked to create a program called Open Communities. Essentially, HUD would use the leverage of federal financing to get local governments to provide low and moderate income housing. The test of this came in Warren, Michigan, which is the state where Romney had been the governor, and Nixon essentially squashed it when he heard of it. He failed to uphold Romney's threat of withholding urban renewal funds. Working groups were established to hash this out, and that's what the Nixon 1971 policy statement that we started with was a result of that work. And ultimately, Romney resigned from the Nixon administration when he was reelected in '72 over this issue. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of significant acts of legislation that happened during this time in response to some of what has been, had been done in the 50s and 60s that I was describing. The Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policy Act required, these types of measures to relocate people when they were being displaced by federally funded housing. And then, of course, we all know CEQA came into play also in 1970. And the basic purposes of CEQA are to inform decision makers and the public about environmental effects, identify ways that environmental damage can be avoided or reduced, preventing significant avoidable damage to the environment by requiring changes to the project with mitigation measures, and then disclosing to the public the reasons why an agency approved the project if there are significant environmental effects. So I feel like much of our current discourse centering on the housing crisis and the NIMBY-YIMBY conflict, I think we can point to Nixon's '71 statement as kind of crystallizing that narrative. And I think that established the status quo that we have, has been perpetuated to this day and persisted for the last 50 years. It really hasn't changed much from that perspective. So this here is the New York Times article that printed Nixon's statement from 1971. So if you're not familiar with it, if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to study it. There's a lot of information in there, and when this was printed and released, the headline was Nixon to enforce rights measures for U.S. housing, but he refuses to impose low and middle income units on communities. Two types of segregation. President stresses racial bars are unconstitutional, but not economic kinds. And so I'll just read to you from the article a little bit because I'm sure you can't read it on the screen. President Nixon pledged today to enforce existing prohibitions against racial discrimination in housing, but it said he would not use federal leverage to force local communities to accept low and moderate income housing against their wishes. In a major policy statement more than 8,000 words long, which was the result of nearly 7 months of internal debate and discussion as a result of the Open Communities attempt, Mr. Nixon clung to and reinforced with elaborate arguments the distinction he made at a news conference this year between racial and economic segregation. The first, he said, was clearly unconstitutional and not tolerated. But at the same time, the president argued racial and economic segregation are not synonymous, and he insisted there is nothing in existing law that authorized, much less mandates, the imposition of low and moderate income housing on affluent communities. The Suburban Action Institute, a group that believes only a deliberate policy of dispersing low and moderate income into the suburbs can break up the growing concentration of Blacks in the inner cities, argued that racial discrimination in the suburbs is the direct and calculated result of economic discrimination, and suggested that Mr. Nixon, by making a distinction between the two, had issued an open invitation to all white suburbs to exclude Blacks through subterfuge. The implications of this policy were compounded by the administration's moratorium on federal housing funds in 1973, and those were in place through his impeachment and ultimate resignation. Through this time, there was a fundamental shift in policy from funding actual construction of housing units to what has now become known as Section 8 Housing Choice Vouchers and the Community Development Block Grants Program. Those were established in 1974's Housing and Community Development Act, which actually references the 1964 Fair Housing Act, not the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And so therefore, the part about affirmatively furthering fair housing was left out. As an aside, the Obama administration set about trying to reinvigorate the affirmatively furthering fair housing. And actually, this February and March, under Ben Carson, HUD was proposing a lot of changes to that particular part of affirmatively furthering fair housing. So the comment period for that ended March 16th. And honestly, I don't know the status of it because that was right about when COVID shut everything down. So we'll have to, if you're interested, you should research what happened with that. So now we're going to talk a little bit about me. When my parents bought their home in 71, which was when Nixon's housing policy was established, it didn't affect them, much like suburban America. So they just kept on living, the suburban life. So this is me as a kid in the 80s and 90s. And I was born in 77, I'll tell you guys that. Through middle and high school, most of the Black and Hispanic kids that I went to school with were bused into our school from Southeast San Diego as part of the voluntary integration program. When I was in 8th grade, I had an experience where I drove home with a classmate who had missed the bus after an after-school activity, and one of our teachers took us, I rode along with him to take my classmate home, and it was the first time I'd ever been in that area. I really had not ever had a reason to go there. And the teacher kind of went on a rant after we dropped this classmate off about the Skyline neighborhood, which is predominantly Black then and now. And I didn't really realize it then in my 8th grade frame of reference, and I didn't have those words then, but that was my introduction to the concepts of redlining, white flight, and racial segregation in housing and schools. The next thing I'm going to show is getting back to my grandfather a little bit. This is the grandfather that I knew. This article here was actually in the San Diego newspaper in 1980. He passed away when I was in 3rd grade, so I don't know what year that would have been, but I was in 3rd grade. So after the house moving business was no longer, I'm sure, profitable, as that kind of fell out of favor, he was a connoisseur of junk. And so he actually owned several junkyards. And there's actually this newspaper article from 1980, and it's so ironic reading this now as a city planner adult, because the city planner for Southeast San Diego was interviewed for this article, and he says there are only about 26 old-time junkyards left in San Diego, says Associate City Planner Ty Rogers. Considering the size of the city, that isn't very many. As the planner who oversees Southeast San Diego, Rogers rides herd on two almost legendary junkyards there. These are City Surplus and Salvage Company at 33rd and Market Street, which was my grandfather's salvage yard, and Battles Building Material at 59th and Market. City Surplus is one of the city's largest. The names of these establishments sound specialized enough, but Rogers classifies both as bona fide Great American junkyards, bargain hunters, Disneylands. And so then it says that City Surplus and Battle Junkyards have been engaged in kind of an ongoing guerrilla war with the city for the last 8 years. Rogers says the conflicts have included the owners' resistance to city demands that they put in solid fences and keep their wares behind fence panels. So I actually have a childhood memory of running down a row of toilets. And you can see in this picture this whole like collection of toilets. And so I just had this mental picture of a little kid running around the junkyard down this row of toilets. And so come to find out that my grandfather had procured a number of toilets from the dismantling of a hotel or something, and he had lined them up outside of his fence line, which I'm sure all of you city planners can appreciate that the city probably didn't appreciate that. And so he, got a citation. So rather than move the toilets, he just built another fence. And so there was a row of toilets between two fences, and that is what I remember running through as a kid. So there's this whole article talking, and there's some really colorful quotes in here, and I won't bore you with the details, but that is those are the memories that I have of my grandfather of being the junkyard guy. And I'm sure we know that those are not considered desirable land uses. And I actually had a conversation with this planner, Ty Rogers. He was very early in his career at this time of this article, and he's since retired, but he spent his entire career as the planner for the Southeast San Diego area. So that was a fun conversation. So, I like I said, grew up in Claremont and moved away to Hawaii for college. My grandmother was Native Hawaiian, and she always instilled in us to claim our Hawaiian heritage. So technically, if you do the fractioning, I would be an eighth. But this became significant in high school because I was a sophomore. I went with her to Hawaii for 2 weeks to study our genealogy, and learned that I could go to University of Hawaii on in-state tuition as a non-resident Native Hawaiian. So I decided to do that as a 18-year-old with a one-way ticket to Hawaii upon graduation. And so that is the period of time where I really noticed the discrepancy between the built environment and the natural environment. So you can see in this picture here how the Diamond Head is obscured by all these really mixed match of buildings that popped up in the 70s. But I was there for 2 years. I didn't stay because there was no urban studies program at UH. So I found the urban studies program at San Diego State and essentially transferred back home to SDSU as a junior. A lot had changed in San Diego just in those 2 years that I was gone. They had hosted the Super Bowl and the World Series in 1998, so there were a lot of investments in infrastructure. Downtown was undergoing a transformation. The trolley was extended through Mission Valley to serve Qualcomm, and a new stadium was at the talk of the town, which became Petco Park. One of the projects that we studied in my urban studies program was the connection of the 15 freeway through City Heights. And so this freeway had been in the plan since the 50s, but this gap had never been finished. And the area was kind of languishing with uncertainty of what its future would hold until the 90s when the project was moving forward, but the community's vision of a tunneled freeway with the neighborhood woven together on the top. And so this is a different area of San Diego, but you can see the similarities between the 94 freeway that we looked at before. And so this is what it looked like when they started, they cleared all the homes and businesses. And then this is what it looks like now. So the project wasn't completely tunneled as was envisioned by the community, but the freeway is below grade, and there are park caps at Terralta Park and kind of a smaller park across, I think, University. So at least there was some connection across the freeway for the community. This was actually one of the first freeway cap projects that was built in the country. And I really hadn't connected the dots to my own family experience at the time, but this was the time that I learned how freeways and other infrastructure projects built in the 50s and 60s plowed through neighborhoods like City Heights, or they would have separated a nicer neighborhood from a less nice one to facilitate the suburban growth. And during the time before the Relocation Act and CEQA, there would have been no compensation for the displaced. They probably were, rentals that were just discontinued and they had to move. And the ones that were left behind bore the brunt of the negative impacts of the freeways in their backyards. So I'm going to briefly tell you about a project that I worked in at the Port of Los Angeles. So you can see the familiar theme here of industrial land cleared. The intent of this project was to actually relocate Harry Bridges Road, which was the main truck arterial through the port area, and build a 12-foot high sound wall right next to the homes on the north side. This was a low-income, predominantly Hispanic area. And they organized to fight against the project, and they eventually won out against the commercial interests. And the port agreed to build the park on that land instead. So I started working on the project in 2005, and that's when the fun really began, because I got to be on the team to select the design consultant. And I presented at community workshops with the landscape architect to hear what the community wanted. I actually drove around with the 3D model in the back of my car to various meetings and presented the design to the Board of Harbor Commissioners when it was approved for the funding in 2007. So I left the port not long after that, but came back for the groundbreaking and ribbon cutting in 2011. The 30-acre park is now an asset to the community, and the next phases are under construction. I think that now you should probably picking up on a theme of an infrastructure project, community opposition, and park. This was the same theme of the completion of the 15 through City Heights that I started my career with at San Diego State. So this is actually a public housing project here across the street that was a major renovation right before the park was built. So one of the many pieces of the puzzle of a growing movement happening in neighborhoods across the nation that have been carved up by freeways built in the 50s is to cap them in order to weave these disconnected communities back together. There's proposals of different areas all over the country, and this one is actually in San Diego, right at the area that my dad grew up. So there's a planning effort that was kicked off in 2016, 2015, 2016 by San Diego, Sandag, and Caltrans to start the planning study for a cap of the 94 freeway, which was inspired by the project in City Heights, right where, this cap is right where my parents grew up, and they left it when they could. And this project is, definitely on the drawing board, not anything that's funded. We all know how long projects take to get built. but hopefully it's not going to be 3 or 4 more generations before we see it constructed. And a project like this would bring full circle for families like ours that were shaped and moved around by these kinds of projects. So that is where I'm going to end my presentation.
All right. Thank you so much, Christine. It was a real treat. I'm really grateful for your time and your interest.
Thank you.
Everyone's giving us the emoji hand of bye. And like Jillian said, if you found this interesting and you would like to support us, the best way to do that is to go to our website, peopleforhousing.org, and sign up to become a member. So with that, I will say thank you and good night.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.